Good evening, everyone. Today is May 3rd and is observed as National Paranormal Day. Perfect day to have this program, Lake Monsters and Odd Creatures of the Great Lakes. Michigan-based author and journalist Shetan Noir will join us to explain what lies beneath the water's surface. The Great Lakes have a long history of lake monster reports and sightings. Join Noir when she talks about the different types of lake monsters that have been reported. We will be recording this program. If you would like to watch it again, please visit our YouTube page on our website. If you have any questions, please use our chat box or question answers feature to post your questions. At the end of the presentation, Shetan will answer all your questions. Thank you. Let us welcome Shetan. Hello, Shetan. How are you doing?
Welcome. Hi, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me do my presentation tonight. Certainly it is World Paranormal Day. Kind of weird that it's not October 31st, but hey, you know, they schedule things when they schedule things.
Yes.
I am a author, I am a journalist, but I am also a author, the owner of Squatch GQ magazine publications. And so with that company, I have a lot of magazines. You can find all of these on Amazon as new issues are uploaded and released. I just took over the company in January, so we are starting fresh, and all the publications are available on Amazon. So we have Squatch GQ magazine, we have Cryptozoology Digest, we have G Hunter Paranormal magazine, we have Watchers Ufology magazine, we have Dinosauria and Prehistoric Creatures magazine, and we also have a few new magazines that will be starting up, one called Weird Travels and one called Rock Hound and Prospecting Journal. So a lot of different subject matters, but all things that I find very exciting to write about.
Here I would like to, and also I would like to tell all our patrons, we also have the book Lake Monsters. It is in our collection. Please come to our library, check out that book. I just wanted, and now I'm going to switch off my video and also audio. Please, everything is yours, Shetan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I also teach at two community colleges, one here in Michigan, which is Kellogg Community College in the Battle Creek and Hastings campus. I teach two courses there, the Paranormal History of the Great Lakes and Cryptozoology of North America. And I also teach down in Perrysburg, Ohio at Owens Community College, and I offer the same two courses there, the Paranormal History of the Great Lakes and Cryptozoology of North America. So when I'm not writing or researching, I'm doing presentations for library. I'm also doing at least one or two paranormal conventions every month all around the United States. And so I'm either always talking or writing. But let's get on to tonight's subject. And that is one that I find very fascinating and I absolutely love. And that is our lake monsters of the Great Lakes, because we have a very long history of lake monster sightings here in the Great Lakes. And as I've done my research, as I've written my book, I picked categories for the lake monster report. So I have 6 categories that they fall into. And the first one that we're going to talk about is the giant fish. So according to Native American legend of the Native American tribes that were around the Great Lakes, it was often talked about that there was a giant sturgeon in Lake Superior. And this fish meant so big that its tail could stir up the storms on the Great Lakes, and particularly Lake Superior. So this would have been a sturgeon of considerable size, considering Lake Superior is our deepest body of water for the Great Lakes. And so it's been talked about that, you know, these lake sturgeon, when they would get angry, would thrash their tails and churn up the water. And it's reported that at least one ship actually got dented by the lake sturgeon's tail. Now, some people would say that they hit a sandbar or a rock formation, but a lot of old-time sailors were suspicious, especially if they knew anything of the Native American legends, and they would often say that no, they hit the lake sturgeon. And so this particular ship had been making its way across Lake Superior, and it was having a rough go of it because it was hitting some storms. And suddenly the ship jerked to stop. And it was such a violent stop that it released the anchors from their chain housings and sank into the water, which took quite a while for the men to haul up because these anchors are quite heavy, and even the chains, that are associated with them weigh quite a bit of weight. So it took them quite a while to reel these back up. And as the poor ship limped back into harbor, they knew that something had happened underneath the boat. So once they got into port and they were able to, get the ship fastened into its slip, they had some underwater divers go underwater, and lo and behold, the bottom of the ship was dented in. And the divers reported that something had hit the ship with quite an immense force to cause that denting. Didn't quite sink the ship because they were able to make it in harbor, but it did put a very big dent into the bottom of the ship. Now, the next category that I'm going to talk about is sea serpents. And when I say sea serpents, that's exactly what they are. Snake-like, log-like creatures that are in the water, and people have seen these as far away as 150 feet from the ship and as close as 30 feet to the ship. And they always report that it is round, circular in shape, anywhere from the thickness of a human leg to a whiskey barrel to a telephone pole. And people report, seeing these all over the Great Lakes. Lake Huron has quite a few reports, especially in the Detroit River area, but even going up and around the Straits of Mackinac, there have been reports of these creatures for a very long time. Now, our most modern day report of the sea creatures is actually in the 1960s era, and it's in the Straits of Mackinac. And this is when a bunch of people who were on land actually spotted these creatures swimming through the water, and they seemed to be playing. They seemed to be interacting with each other. And so people took it upon themselves to contact the local authorities, who sent out a sheriff's draft duty. And the sheriff actually was quite brave because he got into a watercraft. Now, we don't quite know because the story's kind of changed over the years. Some reports say that he was in a rowboat. Some say that he was in a motorboat. Some even say he was in a kayak or a canoe. And he proceeded to paddle out to where these creatures were. But every time he would get within about 10 feet of them, they would dive under the water and swim off. So he was never able to get an actual ID of what they were. All he was able to do was see that, yes, they were a aquatic species that he had never before seen. There was more than one of them. I believe reports say that there was between 3 and 9 of them. And that they were very aware of him because they kept on disappearing under the water as he'd approach. And so he did make his report that, yes, there were sea serpents out in the water of the Straits of Mackinac. Unfortunately, he was not able to get a very close up-hand look at them to see exactly what all they looked like and what the details were. But he did make the report. And now, historically speaking, our reports of these sea serpents, they range from them being brown in color all the way up to purple in color, having stripes, having spots, having long fins. having a pronounced tail. So quite a bit of variety there with what people have been seeing. As for our sea serpents, and like I said, sea serpent reports have happened in Lake Superior, Straits of Mackinac, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. Lake Michigan kind of seems to be a dead zone for most lake monster reports, but we do have some really cool ones, which I'm going to talk about next. So Lake Michigan should really be known as the, if we're going to call them lake monsters, then Lake Michigan has two very well-known reports of giant turtles, but two very different types of giant turtles. Now, we do know, going back to the fossil record, that we did have a marine reptile turtle called Archelon. And Archelon was quite huge, from front to back, about 15 feet, and from one tip of its flipper to the other, from left to right, would have been about 13 feet. So this was a sizable turtle, much bigger than a Volkswagen Bug, probably more the size of a Ranger Ford truck. And these used to swim in the waters. And we do know that they actually swam through the Western Interior Seaway, which at certain points during the changing of the land masses over time, the ice sheets, the glaciers, these waterways opened up into the Great Lakes area. So we do know that certainly this was a possibility, that these Archelons might have been able to get into the Great Lakes. Now, our two stories that we will focus on for the giant turtles category, the first one is the Stearns Bayou Monster. Now, the Stearns Bayou Monster is up by the Ludington area, and it is actually a bayou. Everybody thinks bayous are down in Louisiana and Texas. Nope, Michigan has its bayous too, and this one actually has its own giant turtle report. So on two different occasions, a giant turtle species was seen swimming up the channel and past a cottage that is right on the shoreline there. Now, this was observed by a doctor and his family. This was back in the 1800s. And it was, during that time period, actually the whole 1800s into the early 1900s, a lot of wealthier families would buy vacation homes along the lake shores because it was cooler during the summertime along the lake shores with the lake effect and the breezes and winds and everything than it was in inner city Lansing, Detroit, Grand Rapids, Flint. And so a lot of wealthier families, this is where they would go to cool off during the summertime. So on this particular occasion, even the cottage itself was very warm. And so the father decided he was going to go out and sit on the porch to maybe get some cool air coming in off the lake and maybe get a couple of hours sleep. But as he's sitting there relaxing, hoping to fall asleep, he hears what he can only describe as a school of fish or cattle or animals coming up the channel because they're making such a loud noise. And so he's observing this, and what he sees is there's something just underneath the water surface that's glowing from underneath. And as its flippers break the water surface, it's making all this splashing noise, and it's making quite a ruckus. And it proceeds to swim past the cottage, and he's alarmed because he's never seen anything like this before. And so he is observing this, and as the night wears on, a couple other family members come out because they're hot also and they want to cool off. And so they observe it also, and they're all like, what is that? So they're all kind of mystified. And then they don't see it again for about 2 weeks. So about 2 weeks later, several of the family members are sitting out on the porch once again, trying to, enjoy the cool air that's coming in off the lakes. And they observe this same creature come swimming down the channel. But this time it hauls itself out on the beach area, the sandy beach area that's across from the cottage, and they observe it to be digging in the sand. Well, they soon realize that it's laying eggs, or what they presume is eggs. So the family waits and they watch until the turtle is completely done, and then the turtle goes back into the water and they watch it swim back out towards Lake Michigan. And it's only then that they are actually brave enough to, kind of pursue it in the following way. So they get the rowboat and they carefully and quietly, they paddle across the channel to the sandy beach area, to where they know that the animal is where, and then they very carefully start looking around and they find an egg. Now, this egg was described as being about the size of a medium pumpkin, but it was yellow with purple spots. Now, they had never seen a turtle like this before. They had never heard of a turtle species like this before. So, but not being from the area themselves, maybe the local people knew more about it than they did. So they carefully get the egg up. Now, it's said that the egg is kind of like a leathery sack, almost like a jello consistency inside, so quite wobbly. So they carefully put the egg in one of the men's jackets. They put it in the rowboat. They row back over. And that evening, they are going into town for the ice cream social. So they decide they're going to take the egg with them and ask the local people, what is this? And see if anybody has an idea. So as they are taking a wagon, horse-drawn wagon, into town, they have to go over an old wooden bridge. Now, it's very rickety and bouncy, and the person who's entrusted to hold on to the egg actually is sitting on the side of the wagon. And as they hit a large bump, the egg kind of jolts out of his arm, falls into the river below, and is lost to history. Now, they do say there's a couple of people who go diving down to see if they can find it, but they never recover the egg. So we don't know if the egg was the last generation of this turtle species that was going to be born, or if the mother that gave birth to it was still a producing individual and was going to lay more eggs. But we certainly know that not a whole lot of reports after that have ever been done of this, what they call the hippopotamus-headed turtle that was bioluminescent and bigger than a Volkswagen Beetle. Now, our second turtle report actually comes from Lake Leelanau. Now, this turtle is a little bit different in the fact that it had ended up disguising itself with trees and saplings that were growing on the mud and that's on the top of its shell. Now, if anybody's ever seen a very old snapping turtle, you know that they are covered with algae and plant life, and they can very easily blend in with their surroundings because they use their surroundings as their disguise. So on this occasion, a gentleman decided he was going to go perch fishing out in the middle of the lake. And so he rows out into Lake Leelanau. Now, he doesn't have an anchor with him, but what he does have is a rope on the boat that he can tie the boat to one of these trees. So he happens to paddle up next to what he thinks is a small rise of trees. And as he's proceeding to tie his rowboat up, his rowboat is gently butting against what he just assumes is root formations. That is until a large pumpkin-sized head raises up out of the water on a neck that's almost as tall as he is and proceeds to look him in the face. Now, of course, the young man is totally stunned by this, and he pulls the rope away from the tree that he was tying it up to, falls back into the boat, and this gives him enough of a surf that it pushes him away from the turtle. And the story goes that the turtle went one way and the young man went the other, and he vowed from there on to never go fishing out in a lake again, and not even from shore, because he never wants to see that turtle again, and he wants to let it go its way while he goes his. So that is the Lake Leelanau monster. That is our second turtle report. Now, down in Busco, Indiana, or Cherubusca, Indiana, there is a third turtle legend of a gigantic turtle named Oscar. And they actually have what they call Turtle Days there in Cherubusca, Indiana, where they celebrate Oscar as one of their what I call as a small town monster. And so, but once again, we have a giant turtle report, and it said that the lake or pond that he lives in is only about 30 feet deep, but they've never been able to successfully drain it completely. So they think that Oscar or his relatives still live in the lake or pond today. So who knows? Maybe Oscar is related to either the Stearns Bayou monster or the Lake Leelanau monster, until we actually, are able to, observe the individual and document it. We will probably never know what exactly what species they are, if they're Archelon, if they're just giant snapping turtles. But, we still have the reports, and it's still of interest, to this day. So the next one that I'm going to talk about is also a prehistoric marine reptile, but this falls under the category of the Plesiosaurs, the Pilosaurs, and the Mosasaurs, which we have all had, each one of the Great Lakes has had a report of. Now, oftentimes when we get reports of these creatures, the people refer to them as something rhyming with Nessie. So in Lake Superior, we have Pressy. In Lake Erie, we have Bessie, or South Bay Bessie. So, we have these different plesiosaur type creatures that people were observing. And the reason that the plesiosaurs and mosasaurs became so popular as a lake monster type creature was the fact that people who were migrating from Europe over into the Great Lakes area and over into the United States, this was during a time when paleontology was just finding its roots. So we have Mary Anning to thank for finding all of the plesiosaur, ichthyosaur fossils over on the Dorset coast. And the new science of paleontology, people were, observing these fossil creatures and seeing what kind of outline they would have had. And so in a lot of people's minds, if whales were still swimming in the oceans, if sharks were still swimming in the oceans, if the kraken, the giant octopus, was still swimming in the oceans, well, then surely the plesiosaurs and mosasaurs were still swimming in the oceans at that time. So a lot of people, when they were, coming over on the giant passenger ships, whatever they were observing in the ocean waters, if they did, they assumed that these same species would be in the Great Lakes also, because they were such vast bodies of water. Because people really didn't have a concept of what lived in fresh water, what lived in salt water, and realizing that very few species can traverse both bodies, types of water. So people, when they would see something in the Great Lakes, would automatically assume either it was a sea serpent or it was one of these plesiosaurs. And so, we don't really know what they were observing. Were they seeing plesiosaurs? Were they seeing a boat hull that had been overturned? Were they seeing trash or pollution that, could have taken on the appearance of one of these creatures as it's, you know, floating through the water. We don't really know, but we do know that even as of the I want to say 50s, there was a plesiosaur sighting in Lake Erie, and the eyewitnesses were actually a older woman, her pastor, and the pastor's wife. And they were sitting in her backyard doing a Bible study, and they witnessed what they assumed was a boat that had overturned, and they were worried that people might be drowning. So they go to the water's edge and they're calling out, "Is anybody out there? Does anybody need help? You know, are there any survivors?" And as they're yelling and calling out across the water, they suddenly realize that the hull of this boat starts to very quickly swim away from them. They also see a head and neck raising up out of the water, and they see what they describe as flippers propelling it through the water. And it's only after this happens that they realize this is not an overturned boat. This is a lake monster. This might be Bessie or one of those plesiosaur type creatures that's swimming off, you know, out through the lake, and they've just witnessed it. Now, I have actually gotten reports from people who go fishing all around Lake Erie, and Lake Erie is our most shallowest body of fresh lake water here in the Great Lakes. So it's quite interesting that this is the lake that everybody's seeing a lot of the lake monster plesiosaur reports in, because it's a shallow body of water. But even though they see them, they don't really get a chance to document them. Now, there is also another plesiosaur type creature that's over in Lake Ontario, and he's named Kingsley. Now, Kingsley was described as a large plesiosaur type creature, and the local boat captains who were around there decided that they were going to cash in on the P.T. Barnum craze, and they were going to capture this creature and put him on display. So 3 boat captains came together. One of them built a large dog kennel on the deck of his ship. This is where they were going to house this giant sea creature. Another captain got a giant crane, and what they were going to do, they were going to lasso the creature and control him that way. And then they were going to put straps around his body, haul him up out of the water, and put him in the the large dog pen until they could come up with a suitable containment for him. Now, the third captain's job was to find some way to kind of neutralize Kingsley. So his idea was he went to all the local breweries and he got all the hops and mash, and he then proceeded to sail his ship around the area where Kingsley had been most reported and dumping the hops and mash in hopes that he would get the creature drunk and they'd be able to capture it. And they would all retire because they owned, you know, Kingsley now, and they'd make a huge, you know, profit off of this creature. Unfortunately, they never, or fortunately, they never were able to capture Kingsley. And so it's said that Kingsley probably is still swimming around in the waters of Lake Erie, you know, and still escaping, you know, being captured. So my next category that I'm going to talk about is one that I call the amalgamations, or better put, the sea dragons. And that is typically what they are described at. The first one I'm going to talk about is the one that is one of my favorites, and that is Nibbanimus, the great underwater panther of Lake Superior. Now, this creature is described as having the head of a moose or the head of a lion, particularly a lynx, spiky protrusions along its back, a long spiky tail, horns on top of its head, kind of like either elk or a moose, sometimes with wings, sometimes with legs that were more like flippers. And it's said that the great underwater panther controlled the world of the undead. He was very much a bad spirit, and that he, at any time he chose, could stir up the waters and create great storms on the lakes. And the only thing that would control him was the thunderbird, which would come and use its lightning to, and its claws and talons to beat the lake panther back down and make it behave itself. Now, many Native American shamans would tell the hunting parties, anybody going out foraging for food, to avoid the Great Lakes at all costs, because sailing across the Great Lakes puts you in dire, circumstances, because hand-powered, boats like kayaks, like canoes, rowboats, they only go as fast as the people paddling them. There's no steam power, there's no gas power, there's no sails. And so if you're caught out in the middle of the lake, you are very much at the mercy of the Great Lakes. And we know that if the Great Lakes can take down freighter ships like the size of the Edmund Fitzgerald, what chance does a little, 10-foot, 12-foot rowboat or kayak have out on this water surfaces? So the shamans would tell them, if you have to venture onto the Great Lakes, keep the shore line within eye view, so that if the lake turns bad, you can possibly make it to landfall and protect yourself. Now, I came across an interesting fact as I was doing my research on the lake monsters, and I've had it verified by DNR officers, by biologists, all around the United States, Maine, the East Coast, here in the Great Lakes area, as far as Alaska. And that's the fact that moose not only can swim out into water, but they can dive up to 20 feet deep underwater. And they do this because if the grasses and the plants that they frequently eat during the summertime, if those are dried out or dead or just haven't produced that year, they have another food source, which is the seaweed and the plant life that grows underwater in the Great Lakes. So these moose will swim out and they will dive down and they will eat their fill, and then they will pop back up in the water. And the way that they can do this is they seal their nostrils shut, and they just take a big, huge gulp bite of the seaweed. They come up, they eat it. Now, let's picture this moose. He's probably wet. He's probably covered with algae, probably has seaweed on him. Definitely has that rack of horns on his head, and is probably not too fond of human beings. So imagine you're one of these Native American tribe members, and you're coming around a bend in the lake, and in between you and the shoreline, suddenly this huge monster pops up out of the water and is thrashing about in the water, is attacking your canoe. Well, you're going to paddle as hard as you can to get away from it, and you're going to go back to your tribe and say, "Oh my gosh, we encountered in a Bishu, and he tried to sink our boat." When in reality, it was probably a moose who was diving under the water to eat the vegetation. And when he came up, was probably just as surprised to see the Native Americans, the humans, as they were to see it. So another lake monster or amalgamation I'm going to talk about is a creature called Carcagna. Now, Carcagna was said to be a yellow and black sea dragon type creature that swam. He liked Lake Huron, but he was known to walk across land and go into Lake Ontario. But in this particular story that I'm going to talk about, he was in the Georgian Bay area, and he was making his way down the coastline, and every fisherman in every town was reporting that he was destroying their fishing nets, their baskets, their lines, and he was just causing havoc. But on this one particular occasion, Carcagna meets the infamous or famous character Mike Finn. Now, Mike Finn was one of those tall tale American legends, kind of like Johnny Appleseed and Paul Bunyan, Babe the Blue Ox. So he was known here in the Great Lakes area. Now, Mike Finn was supposed to be this big strapping man and loved to go into local taverns and talk about how he could out wrestle any man. He's wrestled bear, he's taken down moose. He can fight anything and win. So on this particular night, he's in a tavern and he's telling this tale. And as his buddies are laughing it up with him, patting him on the back and saying, "Sure, Mike, you tell him." A stranger comes forward and the stranger says, "Well, if that's the case, boy, do I have a monster for you to take on. And if you can beat this monster, surely you are as great as you say you are." And of course, Mike Finn does not back down from a challenge. So the stranger proceeds to tell him, "Well, there's this creature called Karkagna that is swimming down the coastline, and he should be swimming past the bay here tonight. Why don't you row out and you catch him and you beat him up and teach him a lesson so that he stops destroying all the fishermen's nets and baskets and lines." So Mike Finn says, "Of course, I'm going to do this, and you guys can all buy me a beer when I come back." And so Mike Finn marches out of the bar, and everybody marches out with him because they have to see this. So they go down to the dock, and Mike Finn gets into his sailboat, and he sails off to the middle of the bay. And his friends are kind of looking at each other, and they're like, Mike's a good guy at telling stories, but I wonder if he's actually going to stay out there and if he's actually going to fight this creature if it comes along. So his friends decide that, well, if he's going to sail back in, they're going to catch him. So some of the people stay, near the dock and the other docks so that they can see if he sails his ship back in. And then the rest of his friends spread out to the north and south of the beach, along the beach line, about, 500 feet, so that if he sails back ashore, they're going to catch him and they're never going to let him live down the fact that he lied about this. So morning, it starts to get near morning and morning light's coming and people are like, "Well, we never saw Mike. Nobody ever signaled for it." So everybody starts to go back into town and proceeds to, go back down onto the dock. And the people on the dock are like, "We've not seen Mike Finn. He hasn't come back in. He must still be out there." So as daylight is breaking over the bay, people are kind of watching, and it's not too long before they start to see a small dot on the horizon. And people are wondering what it is. So one of the men present goes and gets his binoculars, and he's looking out, and he's like, "Well, I'll be, that's Mike's boat." But Mike isn't coming, any closer to the dock area. So a gentleman who had a faster motorboat gets in, a couple guys get into his boat with him, and they decide they're going to go out, they're going to see what's going on. So it's a good hour-long process before the men realize that this ship is, headed back to them, and they're pulling the other ship. So it's another good half an hour before they start to hear that the men are yelling something at them, but they can't quite make out what it is. So as the ship is coming nearer and nearer, they start to hear more and more what the men are yelling. And the men in the ship are proceeding to yell, "Get the doctors, go get the doctor, somebody get a doctor." Well, immediately the townspeople set out and they find the local doctor and they bring him down to the dock. And by then the men in the motorboat are tying up on the dock, and they're like, "What happened? What happened?" And the men on the boat are like, "It's Mike." And they point to Mike's boat and they're like, "Well, we don't see Mike." They're like, "Mike's in the bottom of the boat." So a couple of the men jump into Mike's boat and they're stunned because Mike, this big, strapping, burly, happy guy from last night, is now shaking and he's pure white and he's almost catatonic. So they have to lift him up out of the boat. And the doctor comes and says, "Oh my God, we have to get him to my office now." And so as they're hurrying him up the dock, one of the men who's still in the boat happens to look down and sees something in the bottom of the boat. And as he reaches down and picks it up, it's revealed that he's holding these long black and yellow slimy feathers. Now, the one fact or piece of information that the stranger from the night before had not relayed to anyone, certainly not Mike Finn, was the fact that anybody who encountered Carcagna and heard its screams or saw it would immediately go crazy. And so it said on this occasion, Carcagna was the one who beat Mike Finn. And Mike Finn spent a very long time recovering from Carcagna. Now, the final category that I'm going to talk about is hails up from the Lake Superior area, up near Pie Island. And he is certainly the only one that we have a report of. And this is probably because he is one of a kind. This creature, actually, I'm not going to call him a creature because he is the great Manitou, Nibbanimus, which means he's the god of the lakes. Now, the god of the lakes, Nibbanimus, which the great Manitou is a spirit or a god in Native American language. So Nibbanimus is great water. So he is the god of the great waters. Now, his description, as it's been relayed in legend, is a small childish creature, brown in color, covered in a light fuzz of fur, but the bottom portion of him is truly fish-shaped. And it's said that if you observe him while he's out in the water, you might be okay. But if he sees you and he knows that you've seen him, this is when dire consequences happen because he normally sends a storm. And such is the case of the following story. So there was a Native American woman who was traveling alongside some French fur traders. She was helping them do their negotiations as they went into different tribes and ports, and they were trading tobacco and copper for furs, beaver, deer, whatever. And so they were stopping on Pie Island as they were making their way towards the north shore of of Minnesota, Lake Superior. And as they were hauling the canoes onto land, one of the men observed what he thought was a child swimming out in the water, and he made a big commotion about it because who would let their child swim out in these cold, icy waters? And this drew the attention of the Native American woman, who immediately started to panic and tell the men that's not a child. Well, then the men said, well, if it wasn't a child, it had to be some strange type of new beaver that they've not seen before. If it's a beaver that big, they should shoot it and kill it because that pelt's worth a lot of money. Which now the Native American woman is hysterical and she's grabbing their guns and she's telling them, no, that is the great Manitou, Nibbanimus, and we need to get inland because, and as she's saying this, the creature starts waving at them and then dives underneath the water. And she's like, nope, nope, get inland now. Get into the middle of the island. We need to build shelters because he's going to send a storm. And the men are questioning, this is folklore, this is superstition. And she's like, no, do what you want. I'm going inland. I can build my own shelter. Good luck to you. So the men finish hauling the canoes up onto the land, securing them, and proceed to go find the Native American woman. And they start to help her build a shelter. And as they start to build the shelter, the first, raindrops start to fall. And so they quickly, hurriedly put together a shelter. And then for the next 3 days and 3 nights, it rains like nothing they have ever seen before. So much to the point where they are pretty sure that if they had stayed on the beach, they would have been washed into the lake and drowned. And so the Native American woman tells them, do not ever acknowledge that creature again if you see it, because next time he won't be so kind. Which of course the men are like, what do you mean be so kind? That storm was nothing we've ever seen before. And she's like, exactly. He let us live where he could have made it even worse. So the men all decide that from now on, if they see anything that looks like a small brown child swimming in the waters, that they are going to ignore it because they don't really want to take that risk of having that happen to them again. And they never encounter the great Manitou Nibbanimus again. But it's said to be a warning to anybody crossing Lake Superior or any of the Great Lakes, that if you spot this great Manitou, that you should probably ignore him because it's not going to end well for you. And it's also a long honored tradition that with the Great Lakes, you should never take more than what you need. The Native Americans were always telling the white European settlers this: do not take more copper than you need, do not take more animal pelts than you need, do not take more of the tobacco or crops than you need, because if you do, the lake monsters, seeing as you're being greedy, they will decide that they can take back what you took, and that's why they sink the ships. And this has been, what they think is the reason why so many ships have sunk on the Great Lakes is because of the greed of the European settlers of taking everything that they can get their hands on and not leaving anything for the rest of the natural community. And so it's said that when a ship's, loaded to capacity or beyond, especially if it's a natural resource from here in the Great Lakes, that's when the lake monsters start churning up the water and decide to take back what has been taken from them. So with that, I will open it up to questions if anybody has any questions.
I think there is only one question so far, Shetan, and there is one. Do you have pictures of these different types of turtles?
Could you say that again?
Do you have pictures of these different types of turtles?
Oh, okay. No, I don't have pictures of the turtles themselves, because the people who experienced the stories did not take pictures of them. But certainly the description of the lake, of the Stearns Bayou turtle, they said more was like a soft-shelled turtle, but had a very large head that was similar to a hippopotamus. And then the Lake Leelanau turtle, with having trees and stuff like that growing on its back, probably not a very thick tree, maybe just a couple of inches thick, most of them. This could have very well been a giant snapping turtle, like Oscar, and was able to have those growing on its shells and still be swimming around the lake.
I don't see anything. Thank you very much, Shetan, and I really appreciate it. And we really enjoyed your presentation. It was very informative. Thanks again, and you have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.
Mhm.